Hi, welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. In this episode, I'm going to cover how I transfer a pattern to the wood. This information was requested by Kenneth Dunn. So Kenneth, thank you for the request. Now I will also cover how I use lines, dots, and dashes to help me with my burning and show you how I can use a photo or a pattern to transfer from. So let's get started. I recommend using a graphite pencil that is HB or darker. Any brand of graphite pencils will work. Coat the back of the pattern using the side of the pencil. This will cover more area. The layer of graphite doesn't have to be uniform in coverage, but make sure you don't have any gaps and make sure to cover all of the areas you plan to trace. I print my patterns on standard copier paper, which is around 20 pounds in weight. As you apply the graphite, you can overlap your pencil strokes. You can apply them horizontally, vertically, diagonally, or a combination of them all. You can even apply additional layers of graphite. Additional layers will just make the trace lines darker. What you cannot do is use charcoal pencils. Charcoal is very prone to smearing, so it just makes a mess. The trace lines don't stay nice and neat. Instead, they just get blurry. After you are done, hold the paper up to a light source and look for any missing graphite areas. The yellow circle marks a spot I missed. To fix, simply apply graphite to the missing area and then check the pattern again. Place your pattern graphite side down on the wood and get it positioned where it needs to be. Then secure the pattern with 2 pieces of tape. Afterwards, start tracing along the lines on the pattern. Trace just a couple of lines and then check the darkness level. If it's difficult to see the lines, remove the pattern and add another layer of graphite. Erase the trace lines you've done before replacing the pattern on the board. The goal is to have lines that you can easily see, but you don't want really dark lines, as the graphite can get embedded into the wood when you burn them in. Once the darkness level is good, just trace over the lines on the pattern. Periodically, I check my trace lines to look for missing spots. This might happen if I didn't fully trace over the line or if I didn't coat the back of the pattern very well in that area with graphite. Some people like to use colored ink pens to trace in, as it's easier to see where you've been. I prefer to use a mechanical pencil because the point is finer or smaller in size. As I get areas traced in, I draw a tiny X in the area. I barely use any pressure when drawing the X as I don't want it to transfer onto the wood. You can try both methods and decide which one you like best. Before removing the pattern, do one last check for missing lines. It is extremely difficult to replace a pattern in the exact same spot that it was before. After you remove the pattern, place it next to the board and do a final check for missing lines. If you find any, draw them in manually with a pencil. Working with a photo starts out like a pattern. Print it on standard copier paper and coat the back of the image with a graphite pencil. I like to draw a line around the area that I need to coat with graphite. And just like we did with the pattern, hold it up to the light source and look for missing areas of graphite. Really look along the edges of an object, as that is a common place to miss. I'm tracing the image onto paper. Anytime you are using paper, I highly recommend using paper tape to secure the image onto the paper. Paper tape has low tack and will prevent the paper from ripping when you remove it. I do not like to use black and white images to trace from. The reason is that some colors have very similar grayscale values, so I trace from color images to ensure that I get the most detail possible. When tracing from a photo, I use solid lines around items with hard edges, like the outline of the hat. I use either dots or dashes to mark where the highlight boundaries are. Other shapes with hard edges would be the spider webbing, the insects, and the decorative scroll work. Shadows, depressions, darker areas, and highlights are things that I would use with dots or dashes to mark their boundaries. Also, I always have the reference image nearby to consult with as I'm working. If there is a question about some detail, I look at the reference image. I never use the image I'm tracing from, as the pencil marks have altered the details. Check your work often when working on complex images like this. Heck, the same thing applies to complicated patterns. The more complex or intricate the image is, increase the number of times you are checking your work. If you wait until you're done tracing, it will be much more difficult to find any missing lines. There's just too much detail to check on. You can always manually draw in missing lines later, but it's easier if you get them all now. And you can avoid having to manually draw in lines by working carefully and checking your progress often. When I check my trace lines, I like to darken up any lines if I'm having a problem seeing them. Like before, after you are done tracing, place the image next to your trace lines and do a final check for any missing information. Now let's look at some examples from other patterns that I've done. Look how I used solid lines along the hard edges on the fabric. I used dashes for the stitch marks, and I used dots for the boundaries around the shadows. The combination of all three line variations makes it very easy to look at the pattern and know what each item is. With the bow, I use solid lines around the edges of each loop. Then I use dashed lines for the bands of colors on the loops. This made it easy to tell the loops from the color bands on the loops. With the bobcat, it had very few hard edges. Most of the lines that are drawn are dashes, drawn in the direction that the fur grows. This lets me know where the markings are and what direction to burn the zigzags. With the rabbit, the face had short fur, so I used short lines. But the body, I increased the length of the line. This lets me know I have areas of short fur and long fur to work on. Okay, back to the skeleton mask. I'm inking in the trace lines because I'm making a pattern, but in many aspects it's very similar to burning in the trace lines. The great thing with inking in the pattern is that the dark lines are much easier to see, for you to know what I'm doing, and they copy better. I always keep the reference photo very close by as I work. This applies to all stages of the artwork: tracing, pattern making, burning it in, everything. Never use the image you traced from as your reference because the pencil marks have altered the image. For example, you now have dark lines around hard-edged objects, but it is doubtful you will be burning those lines darkly on the board. As you can see, I use a combination of solid lines and dotted lines to indicate different areas of the image. This is a system that I have developed over the years, and it works well for me. You may find that you need to alter things a bit to get a system that works well for you. Now, another thing that I've found that works well for me is when I'm creating a pattern, I will often use a pencil to add a little tone to the dark areas on the image. I think this helps make the pattern easier to follow. Once my pattern is ready, I photocopy it. I never use the original pattern in case I want to use it again later on. At this point, the pattern is treated just like my first example. The back of the pattern is coated with graphite pencil. The pattern is positioned on the wood and secured in place. I trace a line or two and do a darkness test. If the trace lines are not dark enough, I remove the pattern and add more graphite to the back of it. Then I erase the trace marks from the board and reposition the pattern and start over. As I trace in areas, I put little X's to mark spots that I have done. Before removing the pattern, I check for missing lines. Well, that's it for this episode. Kenneth, I hope I covered the questions that you had on the subject, and thank you again for the great suggestion. And thank you everyone for watching my video, and I will see you next week.